This is Dr. Shomasri Rai Chaudhuri, coordinator of this session. This is now the last session, the valedictory session, and the speaker of this session is Dr. Debi Chatterjee, retired professor, international relations, Jadavpur University, as well as former faculty member of Lady Brabourne College, Political Science, as well as she is former student of Lady Brabourne College. Welcome, ma'am, to this workshop, and floor is yours. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you very much for inviting me to deliver the valedictory address today at the end of this workshop that is being held from the 9th till this day. I must congratulate the organizers of this program for having a workshop that has covered such a wide range of women's issues. Her story, through ages, I would say, has been scripted, yet it has seldom been revealed. Through the discussions at the workshop, the narratives which have come up have come from different disciplinary angles. There have been historians who have spoken, looking at the women's issue from the angle of history, chronologically, over time. There have been economists who have tried to delve into the economic roots of the problem. What is the situation that women face economically? From the angle of health, women's issues have been taken note of. From the point of view of psychology, the women's question has been addressed. Law, politics, all these have clearly figured along with several other dimensions. Or in other words, what we have got, I think, in the course of this entire rather lengthy workshop over these several days with people from different disciplines coming together, has been the sharing of their different perspectives on the women's question, trying to understand from different angles her story. Her story, which has remained and continues to remain, I would say, extremely elusive. Before moving on to the main discussion, I would just go into a bit of a personal story here. Over the last week, I was in Manipur, at Imphal, and I had the opportunity of visiting the largest exclusively women-run market, the Ima market, the largest market in Asia, perhaps in the world, exclusively run and managed by women. Ima market suggesting mother's market. And it is estimated that there are some around 3,000 women who sell their ware in the different stalls, ranging from fruits, vegetables, fish, garments, handicrafts, and whatnot. The woman's story, yet largely sidelined. How much are we aware unless you're really researching the field, unless you're really researching in the area, how much are we really aware of the existence of this market and the role that the women individually and collectively are playing there? How it impacts the economy, how it impacts the families and their own lives. This was just a personal experience that I gained over the last few days, and I thought I should share with you and draw your attention to. Moving on to the main discussion, I would say, from what has come up in the discussions, I'm sure, is the fact that over time, women's lives have remained on the fringes, whether we are looking at it in terms of power, the exercise of power, or whether we are looking at it in terms of recognition of their contributions in different fields. From the past to the present. From the past to the present, it is a story of marginality. And the marginality is not accidental. It is backed by a very definite, systematic process of marginalization of women. Across the world, including India, there are and there have been also, alongside, I would say, piecemeal correctives. There have been laws which have come in, off and on, a recognition of the fact that there is a marginality. Today, this is recognized thanks to a persistent women's movement in different countries across the world, going through different phases, throwing up different main issues, primary issues, starting from, I would say, the question of suffrage, bringing in the question of reproductive rights of women, the question of development, the question of empowerment, bringing in issues of the use of internet tools. All these coming up have brought the women's question into focus in a sense. Correctives, as I said, have been instituted. Movements have come. We are familiar with the emergence and evolution of the feminist movement. I shall not go into the details of that. We are familiar with the fact that time and again, international organizations have stepped in. The UN has stepped in. The women's question has gained attention at the international level, just as it has gained attention at the national levels of different states. Of course, again, encompassed within various state narratives, various constitutional systems of the states, various legal systems of the states, and state narratives. For example, how the women's question is being viewed, how women's issues are being viewed in India are not identical to how the women's issue is being viewed, let me say, in Pakistan or Bangladesh or the USA. Now, there is, on the whole, from the past to the present, there is a denial of rights, together with the fact, I would say, the denial of dignity. I bring up both these issues, rights and dignity. I emphasize that they are not identical. Rights and dignity are not identical. And very often we tend to overlook this fact. We can and we do recognize fragmented rights, one, another, and another, without recognizing the importance of dignity and equality, equal status of gender. So here there is clearly a denial of rights and dignity, which in a combined sense, I would say, makes for the denial of human rights. So when we are talking about women's rights, we have to keep in mind the concern for human rights and understand that human rights is not simply a conglomeration of separate rights. It is rights plus dignity, making for a qualitative, clearly a qualitative difference in the field of rights. Now, the denial is at multiple levels. Another point of importance, which I think we need to keep in mind. The denial that a woman faces is at multiple levels: the family, the society, and the state. All these levels have to be again viewed in link with one another. It would be wrong to think that, well, let us address the issues of women in terms of the family only. Let us just look at domestic violence as taking place within the domestic sphere. I would put it, domestic violence takes place within the domestic sphere because society at a larger level encourages the development of a particular perspective relating to women that encourages domestic violence. So the blame, the fault lines, does not simply lie with one person or one family. The fault lines have to be identified within the wider parameters of society. It makes for the mindset, which in turn makes for the violation of the rights of the woman in the family. And she becomes the persistent victim of domestic violence. The state fails to address, or refuses to address, I would say, the wider social issue, because it becomes too uncomfortable for the state. So what happens is, the question is pushed into the frame of one or the other family, one or the other person as being the culprit. The wider frame of social norms, social values that need to be questioned, challenged, and called to task, and where the state should be playing a very crucial role. All these are sidelined in the process. So it is, I would emphasize, high time that we look at these issues in linkage with one another. We recognize the responsibilities of society in this respect, in the marginalization, in the persistent marginalization of women, whether it's in terms of power or whether it's in terms of recognition of the contributions that they have made in the past, or the contributions that they continue to make till date. Whether we look at these contributions vis-a-vis the family, in terms of the family economy, in terms of the state, contributions in the field of the nationalist movement, contributions in the field of politics, at the levels of different political parties, how they are contributing, and also looking at the question of how, when it comes to decision making, starting from the family to the state, women get marginalized. We have been talking a lot about the need to have reservations for women in parliament. For years we have been talking about it, we have been demanding it, and as of now we barely have 14% women in parliament, where women are almost 50% of the population. Yet the fact is, for some or other unknown reason, women's representation in parliament, women's reservation in parliament does not get through. Whereas at the same time, representation of women at the grassroots level in panchayats or municipalities gets through much more easily. Now, will I be wrong if I say that at the level of the panchayat or at the level of the municipality, the decisions which are taken are relatively smaller decisions? Decisions which are taken at the level of parliament are the bigger decisions. Hence, just as in the case of the family, women are confined to taking smaller decisions. At the political level, women taking smaller decisions are more readily accepted than women taking the bigger decisions. Hence, women's reservation in parliament doesn't get through, as I said, for some unwritten rule, whereas women's reservation at the panchayat level, at the grassroots level, gets through much more readily. Look at the home. When it comes to decisions like what will be cooked, the woman has a clear voice. When it comes to the decision of where a house will be bought, it's the male voice that dominates. Is it merely accidental that smaller decisions at the home can be taken by women and not the bigger ones, just as at the level of politics on a wider scale, a similar pattern can be noticed? So these are certain stories of continuities, I think. These are certain stories of continuity, I think, that need to be carefully looked into. I am not suggesting that it always happens. I'm simply suggesting there is clearly a point in investigating these and investigating these seriously. And if we really see that there is this sort of a connection, we cannot compartmentalize these areas and say that, well, that is the story within the four walls of the home. That's different from what's happening at the political level outside the home. So that's another dimension that I think that needs to be kept in mind. The linkage between the family, society, and the state. If her story needs to be clearly narrated, this linkage has to be recognized, and the storyline has to be presented accordingly, from the family to the state and from the state to the family, not leaving out one or not leaving out the other, or not looking at them in a fragmented, compartmentalized fashion. At every level, we find that women are marginal and victims of a systematic process of marginalization. This is a fact. At the same time, I would say, it is a fact that the processes of marginalization, the mechanisms of marginalization, the tools that are used for marginalizing change over time. It is not a process that works or operates in isolation. Over time, marginalization, the story of marginalization undergoes changes. And these changes, again, have to be reckoned with from different angles. When I say they have to be reckoned with from different angles, it becomes obvious that we have to understand them in terms of time. We have to understand the story of marginalization in terms of the history of the country in which it is located. If we are, as I said, if we are looking at India, the story would not be the same as it would be if I'm looking at an African state, or if I'm looking at an European state. So, depending on the history of the country, the story would be different. Depending on the political and constitutional system of the country, the story would be different. It would not be the same. So there are a variety of complexities involved here that have to be understood. The trouble is, very often trying to build, this is a problem of different types of theory building, I would say, at different levels. The trouble is we tend to simplify, in our efforts to simplify, we tend to cast everything within a uniform pattern, suggesting that, well, marginalization follows this course everywhere, more or less along the same lines. It doesn't. It doesn't. It changes depending on time, depending on history, depending on political constitutional systems. It is constantly undergoing changes depending on the social system that we are looking at. And that really throws us into a very, very complex scenario. The basic question there comes up, can we not generalize? Can we not generalize if the picture is so complex? If we try to generalize, or to the extent that we generalize, are we making mistakes? How serious are these mistakes? How far can we accommodate these differences, these diversities? And at the same time, how far can we generalize? So these are certain questions that we have to keep in mind. Now, if we look at the history of the Western intellectual thought, we would find that different thinkers, starting from Aristotle to Rousseau to Aquinas, they had emphasized the subordinate position of women and clearly linked it up with her reproductive role. On the one hand, suggesting that, God has made the female species for childbearing, for procreation. On the other hand, suggesting that because she has this reproductive role, she falls behind, she lags behind the men. So from there we find over time voices of protest have come up. We have found the emergence of women's voices coming up. We have found the emergence of feminist theory coming up. And very importantly, as we are all familiar with, Mary Wollstonecraft's work, which on a vindication of the rights of woman, which came as a pioneering text in the field of women's rights in 1792. So from the mid-18th century, we can say that women's voices, to a large extent, again, influenced by the Enlightenment, by the French Revolution, political upheavals, the emergence of new ideas, economic changes, all these were leading to the coming up of women's voices, the emergence in course of time of what comes to be known as feminism. But at the same time, we need to remember that feminist theory has no single author or source. It has drawn extensively. It has drawn extensively on multiple sources. It has drawn on Marxism, it has drawn on psychoanalysis, it has drawn on sociology. It has drawn on structural anthropology, just to mention a few of the areas, I would say. But then it has, on the whole, despite the different streams or different strands coming up over time, on the whole, it has generated an awareness of the women's question. And women's voices have come up individually as well as collectively. Their voices have come up through participation in movements and protests. Their voices have come up through articulation, through literature. Part of it, we need to remember again, is oral literature. Because with a relatively low literacy level compared to men that women have suffered worldwide, and depending on folk tales, songs, etc. Much of their voices have again been transmitted from one generation to another through word of the mouth. It has been their stories. It has been their story transmitted from grandmothers to daughters to grandchildren, etc. Also, autobiographical pieces have been written at different times in different forms. Literature in the form of poems, stories, novels, etc., have also had their stories included therein. That means at a point, autobiographical writings have virtually merged with stories and novels. Autobiographies are not to be seen separately, but as part of their writings, which again, in some cases, are narrated autobiographies that we come by. Now, in the Indian scenario, if you're looking at the Indian scenario, again, as in any other country, you will find that women's marginalization is steeped in religion, religious practices make for women's marginalization. When it comes to prayers, you will find at the center, the main prayers in the dominant religious discourses, you will find the responsibility lies with the men. The women are involved in the periphery. Traditionally, that has been the role. The priest is the man, not the woman. Of course, we have certain exceptions coming up now as protest voices. We have women priests coming up, but those are exceptions to the rule. As far as the rule goes, it's the man who occupies center stage. Steeped in religion, you will find women's marginalization is clearly evident. If you're looking at the cultural ethos, women's marginalization is evident. Look at caste. It rationalizes women's marginalization, to say the least. I would rather say it rests on women's marginalization. It rests on the caste structure, rests on endogamy. It rests on the control of the female sexuality, minus which caste would not survive. Look at also at the same time, I would say, the lives of women in tribal societies. Substantially different in many cases compared to the lives of women belonging to non-tribal communities. How far have we investigated these differences? How far have we really gone into the depths of these differences? Looking at the social systems of the different tribal communities and suggesting what non-tribal India has to, within quotes, learn from tribal India, so far as gender justice goes. We take these up only as fringe issues of discussion. I think it is time that we bring them into greater focus. Now, if we look at women's protests, we will find that over time, protests by women, articulation of their voices have flowed through different channels. To start with, I would say social movements had been led by men, such as Ram Mohan, Vidyasagar, etc., who were, for a variety of reasons, taking up certain specific women's questions, but in a very limited sense. I shall not go into detailed discussions of that because of paucity of time. But progressively, women's voices have started coming up thereafter. And the compulsions of the nationalist movement, I would say, drew more of women's involvement, and women's voices surfaced. Women had to be given space to add to the numbers. Fighting for freedom, it was no longer possible to keep women within the Ondor Mahal. Access of men from outside within the homes had to be given, and women had to be drawn out from the homes onto the streets to fight. There were the compulsions of the nationalist movement. We were opening up not because we wanted women to enjoy a better life. We were opening up because of the compulsions, the wider compulsions of the political milieu. Also, the compulsions of industrial production in course of time demanded more women join the labor force. And as that happens, keeping women isolated does not work. So again, once again, certain rights for women have to be conceded, recognized. Once again, I would say, not just because it was necessary for meting out justice to women, but because there were wider economic compulsions for drawing women into the labor force. It was being accepted. And step by step, women's voices on the one hand were coming up, women's demands were being considered step by step, and at the same time, restrictions again, the marginality of women was being reinforced, was being retained, because after all, women were providing a pool of cheap labor. Till date, women provide an enormous pool of cheap labor. And because of that, keeping the woman marginalized is convenient for the family, it is convenient for society, and it is convenient for the state. Now, even as the women's voices were coming up, I would say, to a large extent, the women's movement in India, which was becoming visible, was an upper class women's articulation. But at the same time, this upper class women's articulation was trying to bring in all women's issues within that single frame of women's oppression or women's concern areas, which unfortunately was not the reality. Parallel to this, there was another discourse which did not gain the amount of attention that it should have gained or could have gained. That was to be found in the alternative non-Brahmin tradition. Phule, Ambedkar, Periyar. That line, if we are looking at that line, and today, if we are looking at the demands of the Dalit feminists, the challenges that Dalit feminists are posing, the questions they are raising to the Dalit movement as well as to the women's movement, the feminist movement in India. That is the alternative line that should have gained much more attention, but unfortunately did not gain that amount of attention. That was the line that linked up, and rightly so I would say, linked up the question of caste and gender oppression, which is so vital in the Indian context. We cannot understand caste oppression in India without understanding gender oppression, and we cannot understand gender oppression without understanding caste oppression. The two are inseparably linked, and it is this alternative tradition that really looks into this linkage between the two. Now, in 1989, Kimberly Crenshaw had coined the notion of intersectionality vis-a-vis women of color. The question was being raised to show how women of color were being left out in the feminist discourse. Just as that was being done in that context, in the Indian context, the emergence of the Dalit feminist voice has drawn again on Crenshaw's analysis. And again there, the complexity since the late 80s through the 90s onwards, this complexity or diversity of women's oppression is sought to be gauged in greater details. Put in a simple way, we can say, the experiences of the upper caste woman or the upper class woman are not identical to the experiences of the poor Dalit woman. Both suffer oppression, both suffer marginality, but the experiences are different. We talk a lot about the Andar Mahal, for example. At a point of time, it was very central to a lot of discussion. What if I say, for a poor Dalit woman, there is no Andar Mahal? There is hardly a roof over the head. There is no question of gender isolation. She works in the field, and she has done that through generations, alongside men. There is no parda there. Yet she gets raped. She's a victim of gang rape. She does not enjoy equality. But she is part of the production process directly. So experiences are different. And the differences of experiences have to be recognized. Simply because we are finding it difficult to fit in these differences into our frame of discussion, let us push it under the carpet can hardly be an answer. We have to recognize, particularly in view of the fact that today their voices are being raised by them. and they are bringing up the demands. You have not spoken for us. Speak for us. Now, here again, what feminism tries to do or is trying to do is to grasp the question, the woman's issue, theoretically. It is also trying to guide it operationally. But her story, I would say, goes beyond feminist theory. Chronologically, her story precedes feminism. In terms of expanse, in terms of diversity, her story goes beyond feminist articulation, as of now. In the process, as a result, feminism is constantly trying to reconstruct itself. It is constantly trying to widen its parameters, trying to accommodate the diversity. And as we have tried to show over the course of our discussion, this diversity is enormous. This diversity is enormous, and feminism is really grappling with it. Now, finally, the main point here which I would like to bring up is who speaks for whom? Who can speak for whom? Authenticity of the voice of the voiceless. A large section of women are still voiceless. Their ideas, their sufferings, their pains remain unarticulated. What does that imply? Does it imply that we should wait till they speak? Does it imply others should speak for them from the point of view of their own experiences, from the point of view of their own analysis? Would that or could that be a genuine reflection of their lived experiences? If not, then what? So these are certain very, very basic areas which I think need to be considered because one speaking for the other. When there was a time when men were speaking for women. There was a time when men were speaking for women, and there were limits of that. Followed by a time when, by and large, the woman's voice comes up and demands space and demands recognition. And in its own right, it found a space. But as it found a space, as it was being articulated, as the voices were being articulated, at a point it was the individual woman's voice. Rashundari speaking about her experiences. Even where they were in line with experiences of others, it was essentially her experience. Amar Jibon, Byakti Jibon, the individual's life. At a point from there, we move to a collective sense of identity. Ours, our experiences, a shared sense of pain, experience, expectations, etc. All having multiple dimensions and multiple facets, which I have already right at the beginning pointed out, starting from history to economics to psychology to health to politics and whatnot. Bringing in all this, there are stories of collective experiences, shared experiences being articulated. The women's movement gains momentum. That movement gains momentum not just because of women's interests, but for economic and political factors which were conducive at different points of time, which have to be also reckoned with. But at the same time, that was again limited, and the limitations are increasingly coming into focus. That was limited by the leadership pattern that was being provided in the movement. Their experiences. It was not always a question of if I may say so, a fault. It was not necessarily a fault. It was the consciousness. It was the consciousness as it developed and as they believed that, well, our experiences are their experiences, but it was not. It was not their experiences. And from the late 80s, they started saying that, well, these are not our experiences. And the Dalit voices come up. Again, within the Dalit voices, we also note that you will find further differences when you are looking at Dalits who got converted. Converted to Islam, converted to Christianity. The basic question would come up, have their experiences again been the same as the experiences of the Hindu Dalit woman? Again, another diversification of the root. So all these have to be accommodated, understood, and as I said, who, to what extent can voice these experiences, the demands, the situations, which again, over time, I emphasize, will be undergoing constant changes. Constant changes in marginalization pattern on the one hand, in protest pattern on the other hand. Both would be relevant. Both would be relevant. As socioeconomic political systems change, marginalization forms would change. Exploitation patterns would change. As technology changes, newer forms of women's exploitation would surface. At the same time, the response again would be different. The response again would have to constantly adapt itself, and the responses would be diverse when we look at different categories of the women. I have simply tried to bring into focus some of the important areas which I thought needed to be highlighted here. I think I have raised more questions, unfortunately, than I have answered. These are questions which we need to ponder about. And in the process, finally, I would say, India has a diversity of population and social systems, an enormous diversity, and we need to carefully look at these social systems and diversities and see how the woman's question can be understood from these different angles. As I said, look at tribal society. You will find perhaps a lot to draw from there, though I would not say tribal women enjoy a position of equality with their male counterparts. Thank you very much. I think my time is up by now.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for your enriching speech as well as thought-provoking speech. Thank you once again. Now it is her stories will continue, definitely. Now the time for vote of thanks. Vote of thanks will be given by Dr. Professor Sanjukta Dash, coordinator of this workshop. Over to Professor Sanjukta Dash. Camera on করে দাও? On করে দাও।
Thank you, Shomasri. As this 7-day international interdisciplinary workshop, Her Story, Past, Present and Future, comes to its online conclusion, thanks are due to all those who have made it such a success. The eminent speakers who have brought to this workshop their rich research and experiences from their respective fields, our sincere thanks to you. Our thanks to ICSSR-ERC, Eastern Regional Cell, for sponsoring the workshop, and the NGO Swayam for the collaboration. Principal of Lady Brabourne College, Professor Shuli Sarkar, Madam, thank you very much for the tremendous interest and support and advice that you have been giving from the inception of this idea of the workshop to day-to-day details. Dr. Parna Ghosh and Mohua Roy, coordinators of the Women's Studies Center, no thanks are enough to convey what you have done, beginning long before the workshop, planning, executing, liaising with infrastructural resources and participants, and preparing all the back and forth correspondence with the resource persons, thinking ahead and taking care of all the details. Your steadfast presence at the control room in the college auditorium has made the whole process smooth and seamless. And we all know that the next phase, the publication, awaits your attention. The IQAC coordinator, Dr. Indrani Chaudhuri Dutt, thank you. Women's Studies Center External Advisor, Dr. Aparna Bandopadhyay of Diamond Harbour Women's University, and Home Advisor and Economics Faculty, Ruby Pal, thank you. Dr. Srimati Mukherjee, Teachers Council Secretary and Member, Women's Studies Center, thank you. Members of the Women's Studies Center, Dr. Shomasri Rai Chaudhuri and Dr. Shulagna Chakraborty for meticulous account keeping, liaising with the bank, and so much else. Shushmita Goswami for her role as a workshop coordinator. Dr. Amrita Basu Rai Chaudhuri and Dr. Malini Mukherjee, thank you for multitasking support at so many levels and always with such good cheer. Colleagues who have stepped in as anchors and chairpersons, thank you. Dr. Bratati Chakraborty, who has handled the technical support, thank you. Mr. Arvind Prasad of Arvind Database, who has hosted this online event and been there beside us through the proceedings on all the 7 days, thank you. Uninterrupted power supply was assured by Mr. Kirit Rana, General Manager, LT, Calcutta Electric Supply Company. Thank you. Internet Technical Support Agency for the college, Subhash Babu of AK Infotech, and Shonjeev and Shubir of RDG Software for the computers. Thank you for being with us all through these 7 days. Dr. Abira Chakraborty, librarian, who has arranged for refreshment throughout the 7 days for the technical support team, thank you. For non-teaching staff, Dhiraj Raut, staunch keeper of the workshop control room in the auditorium and its various infrastructure systems, a big, big thank you. Finally, dear participants, your interest and enthusiasm have energized us. Your queries have helped us. Your presentations have enriched us. Thank you so much, and hope it has been a good journey for you too. It has been great having you on board these 7 days. Good luck and all the best.